I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't send a single angry text. When my brother told me he was taking over my photography studio, the one I'd spent 4 years building from nothing, I just said, okay, good luck with it. And I meant every word. Let me back up, because if I start in the middle, you're going to think I'm the villain of this story. I promise you, I'm not. My name is Claire, and I'm 31 years old. I live in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is a beautiful city that does absolutely nothing to stop families from being complicated. I have a brother named Marcus, who is 3 years older than me and has, for as long as I can remember, been the son that the rest of our family orbits. My parents, my dad is a retired marine engineer, my mom taught high school English for 26 years, are not bad people. I want to say that clearly. They are warm, generous, community-minded people who somehow, without ever meaning to, raised one daughter who learned to be self-sufficient and one son who learned that someone would always clean up after him. I started Clearlight Studio when I was 27. I've been second shooting weddings on weekends for 3 years while working full-time at a marketing firm downtown, saving everything I could, eating a lot of rice and frozen vegetables, and slowly learning that what I actually wanted to do with my life involved a camera, natural light, and portraits of people during the most important moments of their lives. I found a space on Barrington Street, a heritage building, second floor, gorgeous north-facing windows, exposed brick, and I signed my lease in October. I painted it myself. I built my client database myself. I filed my own incorporation papers, got my HST number, opened my business account at Scotiabank, and took out a small business loan for the equipment. My parents came to my soft launch and they were proud. My mom cried. My dad shook my hand, which for him is the equivalent of a standing ovation. Marcus didn't come. He said he had plans. This is not unusual. Marcus has always had plans that take precedence. He has also always had an uncanny ability to have plans that require money. Not small amounts of money either. Over the years, my parents had covered a failed landscaping venture when he was 25, a food truck that lasted one summer and was sold at a significant loss, and a cabin rente project up near Kajikujik that never got past the stage of Marcus buying a piece of land he couldn't afford to develop. Each of these adventures ended with Marcus explaining that the market had shifted, or his partner had let him down, or the timing wasn't right, and my parents nodding and absorbing the loss. I never said anything. It wasn't my money. By the time I opened Clearlight, I'd been quietly supplementing my parents' finances for almost 2 years. Nothing dramatic. A few $100s when the property tax bill came in, covering their car insurance renewal when my dad mentioned it was coming up and his pension check had been thin, helping with a plumbing repair that Marcus had promised to arrange and then forgotten. I didn't keep a ledger. I didn't expect anything back. I just quietly made sure things were okay, because making sure things were okay is, apparently, my factory setting. Clearlight grew steadily. By year 2, I had a waiting list for portrait sessions and I'd hired a part-time assistant, a 22-year-old named Priya, who was studying visual arts at NCAD and had more natural talent than I'd had at her age. By year 3, I was fully booked 8 weeks out and had paid off the business loan 14 months early. I bought a second body, 2 new lenses, and a proper studio lighting setup. I repainted the brick wall a warm terracotta. I had a real waiting area with a kettle and good coffee and a rack of sample albums clients could flip through while they waited. I was proud of it. I am still proud of it. Marcus came by once during that period, unannounced, on a Tuesday afternoon. He walked around the studio with his hands in his jacket pockets, nodding slowly the way people do when they're calculating something. He asked how much my rent was. He asked how many sessions I did per week. He asked whether the lease was in my name or my company's name. I remember thinking his questions were strange, but Marcus has always been a person who asks strange questions because he is always, somewhere in the background of his mind, running a business plan. He called it a vibe check. I made him a coffee and let him leave. The call came on a Thursday evening in February. I remember it clearly because I had been editing a set of newborn photos and I was in that soft, quiet headspace you get into when you've been looking at pictures of sleeping babies for 3 hours. My mom called, not Marcus, which should have told me something. She sounded strange, careful, the way she gets when she's about to say something she's rehearsed. She told me that Marcus had a new business idea, a fitness and wellness studio. He'd been doing personal training on the side for a year and had built up a clientele and he wanted a proper space. He had found, she said, a great location. The rent was manageable and the layout was perfect and the lighting was beautiful. I said that sounded exciting. She paused. Then she said, "He thinks Clearlight would actually be ideal." I put down my coffee. She kept talking. She said Marcus felt the space was being underutilized, his word, and that a fitness studio would bring in more consistent revenue than portrait photography. She said he looked into it and the square footage was right and the heritage designation actually gave the building a premium feeling that would appeal to his clientele. She said my dad thought it was a smart idea. I asked her if she was suggesting that I give Marcus my studio. She said not give, exactly, more like transition. She said Marcus had spoken to someone, she didn't know who, and that he thought there might be a buyout arrangement, something reasonable. She said family should help family. I said I would think about it. I did not think about it. What I did instead was call my accountant the next morning and ask her to pull together everything, every statement, every filing, every asset on the books. Then I called a commercial real estate lawyer I'd met at a Halifax Chamber of Commerce event 2 years earlier, a woman named Deborah, and I booked a consultation. Then I called Marcus. He answered on the second ring, which means he was expecting me. He started before I could. He said he'd been wanting to talk to me about an exciting opportunity. He said the wellness industry was growing at a rate that portrait photography simply couldn't match. He said he had 22 committed clients who were paying him out of pocket right now and would absolutely follow him into a proper space. He said he'd done the math and Clearlight was sitting on square footage that could generate twice the monthly revenue if it was used differently. I let him talk. He talked for 11 minutes. I know because I was watching the timer on my phone. When he stopped, I said, "Marcus, it's my business. I built it. It's not available." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very evenly, that he thought I was being short-sighted. He said I was letting sentimentality get in the way of a practical opportunity. He said our parents had done a lot for me over the years, which was interesting, given that I had been quietly paying their insurance and property tax, but I let that go, and that family meant making sacrifices sometimes. I said I wasn't sacrificing my business. He hung up. What followed was 3 weeks of a particular kind of pressure that only families can generate. My mum called every few days, not to argue, just to mention how stressed Marcus seemed, how much potential this idea had, how it would be so nice if we could all be supportive of each other. My dad sent me a text, which he almost never does, saying that he hoped I was keeping an open mind. Marcus himself went silent, which I knew from experience meant he was working a different angle. The different angle revealed itself on a Saturday morning when I arrived at the studio at 9 to find Marcus already inside. He had a key. He had gone to my parents' house and found the spare key I'd left there for emergencies, real emergencies, not this, and he had let himself in. He was standing in the middle of my shooting floor with 2 men I didn't know, and they were measuring walls. I stood in the doorway and I looked at him, and I felt something shift very quietly inside me. Not anger, exactly. It was more like clarity. The specific kind of clarity that arrives when you finally understand that someone is not going to stop. I asked him what he was doing. He said he was getting dimensions. He said he'd been thinking about the layout and he wanted to see how the equipment situation would work. He said it in the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. I asked him to leave. He said he didn't think that was necessary. He said we needed to have a real conversation about the transition and I'd been avoiding it. I asked the 2 men he'd brought to leave, and to their credit, they looked uncomfortable enough that they did. Then I told Marcus that entering my business premises without my permission was not a gray area. I told him the lease was in Clearlight Photography Incorporated's name, that I was the sole director, and that he had no legal standing to be here. I told him if he came back without an invitation, I would call the Halifax Regional Police non-emergency line and report an unauthorized entry. He laughed. He actually laughed. He said I'd been watching too many legal dramas. Then he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, "Claire, you've always been the one who holds everything together and gets nothing for it. That's not going to change. The only difference is what space you're doing it in." Then he left. I stood in my studio for a long time after that. I looked at the terracotta wall. I looked at the gallery of sample prints I'd hung along the east side. Portraits of families and couples and newborns, 100 moments I'd been trusted to capture. I thought about what Marcus had just said and I understood, in a way I hadn't quite let myself understand before, that he genuinely believed it. He believed I would fold. He had watched me fold my whole life, absorb the inconvenience, pay the bill, smooth over the moment, and he had no reason to believe this time would be different. That was his mistake. I did not go home and cry. I went home and I called Deborah, my lawyer, and I told her what had happened. She told me to document everything, the entry, the date, the time, what was said. I already had. I'd been recording the call with Marcus from the first week, because I had learned by then that when Marcus is running a plan, he says things in private that he denies in public. Deborah told me to change the locks on the studio immediately and to add a clause to my lease amendment that explicitly named unauthorized entry as a breach of quiet enjoyment concern to flag with the building's property manager. I did all of this by Monday. Then I did something else. I called my parents and I told them I'd like to have Sunday dinner together, just the four of us. No Marcus. I said I wanted to talk about some family things. They agreed, a little warily. My mom made her roast chicken, which is the meal she makes when she is trying to keep something from getting worse. Over dinner, I was calm. I told them I understood they wanted to support Marcus. I told them I knew they loved us both. I told them I wanted to be honest with them about the financial reality of my business, because I thought they deserved to have actual information. I showed them, on my phone over the kitchen table, 2 years of Clearlight's revenue, the loan payoff, the current client waitlist, the assessed value of my equipment. My dad went quiet in the way he does when numbers are telling him something he can't argue with. I told them I was not going to give Marcus my studio. I told them I was also not going to keep supplementing their finances in the background while simultaneously being asked to subsidize Marcus's next venture. I said this without bitterness. I just said it plainly, the way you say something that is simply true. My mom started to say something about Marcus needing support right now, and I said, "Mom, I know, but I am not the solution to that." My dad reached across the table and put his hand on my mom's, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "She's right, Margaret." My mom didn't speak for the rest of dinner, but she squeezed my hand when I left. Marcus apparently was not receiving the same message. The following week, Priya texted me at 11 in the morning on a Wednesday. I was off that day. She was doing an administrative catch-up to say that Marcus had shown up at the studio again. This time with my mum. He had not managed to get in, new locks, but he was knocking and my mum was on the phone to me before Priya had finished her text. My mum said Marcus just needed to see the space one more time. She said it would only take a few minutes. She said it wasn't a big deal. I said, "The answer is no. Please tell him to leave." She said I was being inflexible. I said, "If he doesn't leave in the next 10 minutes, I'm calling the property manager and reporting an incident. The building has exterior cameras and I will request the footage." They left. What I did not tell my mom on that call was what I was already doing in the background. Because I had, by this point, put a plan together. Not a revenge plan. I want to be clear about that. I don't actually enjoy conflict. What I had built was a documentation strategy, and it had been running quietly for 5 weeks. Every call with Marcus recorded. Every text screenshotted and sent to a separate folder. A letter from Deborah to Marcus's personal email sent on Clearlight letterhead, formally notifying him that further unauthorized entry attempts would result in a trespass complaint. His response to that letter, dismissive, a little mocking, 2 paragraphs about how I was escalating unnecessarily, saved and forwarded to Deborah. And one other thing. I had spoken to the property manager of the Barrington Street building, a very organized woman named Gail, who I had always gotten on well with, and I had asked about the Heritage Property Compliance Review that I knew was scheduled for the spring. Heritage properties in Nova Scotia, under the Heritage Property Act, have specific maintenance and alteration requirements. Any tenant wanting to make alterations needs to submit plans and receive approval. I had been careful, over my 4 years in the space, to do everything correctly. New lighting fixtures submitted and approved. The terracotta paint submitted and approved. Every small change documented. Marcus had told my mother, who had told me without realizing she was telling me, that his plan for the studio involved removing the half-wall divider near the entrance, the one that created a small reception alcove, to open the floor plan for group fitness classes. That half-wall is load-bearing. I had learned this when I originally renovated the space, and I had made note of it in my own records. More importantly, the building's heritage designation meant that any structural change required not just the property manager's approval, but a formal application to the Heritage Registry Office and a structural engineer's assessment. I flagged this to Gail in a friendly, informational way. I mentioned I'd heard there might be interest in the space from someone considering structural modifications, and I just wanted to make sure she was aware of the compliance requirements. Gail, who runs a very tight building, was grateful. She said she'd make note of it in the file. I did not do anything else. I didn't need to. Here is what happened next, and I want to be accurate about the sequence because this is important. Marcus, having not managed to get me to agree to anything, decided to take a different approach. He went to my parents. He told them that he had done extensive research and that Clearlight was an asset that could be transferred and relaunched under a new brand with minimal cost. He told them the business model was already there, the client base, the space, the equipment, and he just needed to step in and redirect it. He said the problem was me being emotionally attached. My parents, and this is the part that I still have to breathe through, co-signed a personal loan with Marcus for $40,000 using their house in Dartmouth as collateral. The idea was that he would use the funds to buy me out. He hadn't asked me what my buyout price was. He had simply decided on a number, $30,000, and the remaining $10,000 was for his relaunch costs. I found this out not from my parents, but from Marcus, who called me on a Tuesday evening sounding genuinely triumphant and told me he had financing in place and he'd like to schedule the transfer. I said, Marcus, I have never agreed to a transfer. What are you financing? He said the buyout. He said $30,000 was fair and he'd had someone assess the business. I said, who assessed it? He named a person I had never heard of. I said, Clearlight's book value including equipment, client base, and brand equity is currently assessed by my accountant at just over $110,000. I sent the formal valuation to Deborah's office. If you'd like to make an offer through proper channels, you can have your lawyer contact mine. Silence. Then he said, you're not being reasonable. I said, I'm being completely reasonable. I'm telling you the actual value of the thing you want to buy. He said the valuation was inflated. I said Deborah had the documentation if he wanted to dispute it. He said I was making this harder than it needed to be. I said I hadn't made it anything at all. He had entered my business without permission, pressured our parents into using their home as collateral for a transaction I had never agreed to, and was now calling me unreasonable for knowing what my own business was worth. He hung up. I called my parents that same night. My dad answered. I told him, very directly, that Marcus had taken out a loan using their house as collateral for a purchase that I had never agreed to and was not going to agree to. I told my dad that unless Marcus had somehow misrepresented the situation to them, they had put their home on the line for nothing. My dad went very quiet. Then he said, he told us you'd agreed in principle. I said, I have never agreed to anything. Please call your bank tomorrow morning. I could hear my mom in the background asking what was happening. Deborah sent a formal letter the next day. It was addressed to Marcus, with copies to my parents and to the loan institution, clarifying that no agreement for the purchase or transfer of Clearlight Photography Incorporated existed in any form, verbal or written, and that any suggestion to the contrary was factually incorrect. The loan didn't collapse immediately, these things take time, but what it did was create an extremely uncomfortable 3 weeks in which my parents were suddenly aware that they had put their house in Dartmouth on the line for a plan that had no foundation. My dad called Marcus. I don't know exactly what was said, but my mom called me the following Sunday, and she sounded very tired, and she said, I think we made a mistake. I said, I know. I'm sorry you're in this position. She said, you tried to tell us. I said, yes. Meanwhile, something else was happening that I had not engineered but had, perhaps, enabled by flagging the right information to the right people at the right time. The Spring Heritage Compliance Review came through, and Gail, being thorough, had included in the property file my note about potential structural modification interest. The Heritage Office, also being thorough, had sent a general compliance notice to the building reminding all tenants and prospective tenants of the alteration permit requirements. Marcus, who by this point had apparently decided to proceed with his plan regardless of my cooperation, I still don't fully understand what his theory was. Perhaps that he could pressure me into signing something eventually, had already been showing the space to potential clients. He had taken a few of them up to the studio on the pretext of a showing, let them in and given them a tour of what the space would look like as a fitness studio. He had described the renovation plans. Specifically, he had described removing the entrance divider to open the floor plan. One of those potential clients happened to mention this to someone who happened to mention it to the Heritage Office's community liaison. I want to be careful here. I did not make that call. I didn't know it had happened until after the fact, but I had created the conditions in which the information was already in the right hands, and sometimes that is enough. The compliance officer visited the building in the 3rd week of April. She met with Gail. She reviewed the file. She noted that there was a flag regarding potential structural alterations to a heritage-designated property without a submitted alteration application. Then she noted that someone had been accessing the second-floor unit and describing renovation plans to third parties. That someone was Marcus. He was not a tenant of the building. He had no lease. He had no authorization from me or from the property manager to access the space or to represent it in any capacity. Gail, who had now pieced together a fairly complete picture of what had been going on, was not pleased. Marcus received a formal notice from the building's property management company. He received a follow-up communication from the Heritage Compliance Officer noting that describing planned structural alterations to a heritage property without an approved alteration permit, even in a sales context, constituted a compliance concern that would be documented. He received, finally, a letter from Deborah on my behalf formally notifying him that his repeated unauthorized representation of my business premises had caused material harm to my professional and contractual standing and that I was reserving the right to pursue damages. He called me. I didn't answer. I texted, "Please direct all communication to Deborah's office." He called my parents. My dad, from what I understand, told him that he needed to stop. I don't know exactly what the conversation between my parents and Marcus looked like after that. What I know is that the loan, which had been taken out against my parents' Dartmouth home, where my dad has lived for 34 years, had to be dealt with. Marcus had no path to the business he'd used to justify it. The bank had, by this point, been formally notified that the underlying transaction did not exist. Marcus had $40,000 in personal debt and no asset to show for it. My parents spent several very stressful months sorting out the collateral situation. My dad eventually negotiated a repayment structure with the bank that didn't require selling the house, but it involved Marcus being on the hook for the monthly payments with no parental safety net. I helped my parents, at their request, understand the paperwork. I sat at their kitchen table in Dartmouth with the documents, and I walked them through each line, the same way I'd been quietly fixing things my whole life. Except this time, they knew I was doing it, and they thanked me for it, and my mom said something she hadn't said in a long time. She said, "We should have listened to you." I said, "You're listening now." Priya got a raise and a full-time contract that September. She's now my studio manager, and she is, genuinely, one of the best people I have ever worked with. Clearlight is still on Barrington Street, second floor, north-facing windows, exposed brick. The terracotta wall is still there. The kettle is still on. The sample albums are still in the waiting area. Marcus is doing personal training out of a rented gym space in Sackville. I think he's okay. I hope he is. I don't have his number in my phone anymore, not because I'm angry, but because I have learned something important about the kind of energy I want to spend my days maintaining. My dad came to Clearlight's 5th anniversary gathering in October. He stood in the middle of the shooting floor with a glass of sparkling cider and looked around at the space, at the gallery wall, at the equipment, at the 20 or so people who had come to celebrate, and he said, quietly, to no one in particular, "She built this." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. If there's anything I want you to take from this, it's not that I'm clever or that I won. I don't actually think of it as winning. What I think is that there is a kind of person in every family who learns very early to make themselves small and useful, to absorb and smooth and cover, and that person is so good at it that everyone around them, even people who love them, stops noticing the cost. And when that person finally decides to stop, to stand still, and let the natural consequences of everyone else's choices arrive without interference, it looks like strategy. It looks like a plan. But really, it's just the first time they let themselves take up the same amount of space as everyone else. I didn't fight my brother. I just stopped standing in front of the consequences that were already headed toward him. That's all it took.